I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's forum event with Sir Leon Britton, who is going to speak about Europe, the New Tiger, ? The popularity of our speaker is illustrated by the number of co-sponsors at Harvard who are involved with this event. We have the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here at the Kennedy School, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and Harvard Center for European Studies, all helping on this. And this will be this year's Malcolm Weiner Lecture. Tonight's speaker, Sir Leon Britton, is Vice President of the Commission of the European Union, and he has been a member of the Commission since 1989, where he has been in charge of competition policy and financial institutions, external economic affairs, and since January 95, trade policy and bilateral relations with North America, Australia, China, Hong Kong, Japan, and Korea. Sir Leon has a very distinguished career in British politics. He's a graduate of Trinity College, Cambridge, and following the election of 1979, he joined the Thatcher administration, where he held cabinet positions as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Home Secretary, and Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. As Trade Commissioner for the European Union, he's the principal architect of the new transatlantic marketplace initiative, which the British newspaper The Guardian recently said could revolutionize trade relations between the United States and the European Union. I think we may hear a bit more about this evening. It aims to reduce the potential for trade disputes by eliminating all industrial tariffs by the year 2010, creating a free trade area and services, and further liberalization in the area of government procurement, intellectual property, and investment. Sir Leon has a strong interest in many areas, but I should add that he also has a strong interest in hill climbing, cricket, and opera. And you will find some fans of each of those here. So we're pleased to have him join us at the Kennedy School of Government in this forum, and we're honored to have you welcome Sir Leon.
Dean Nye, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here at Harvard this evening in an academic atmosphere which brings back very happy memories of the year that I spent studying in the United States, even though it was at a rival university. Now, some of you may think that the title of the speech, Europe, the New Tiger, ? Is either provocative or simply bizarre. You may conceivably not be in the habit of thinking of Europe as an economic tiger. And indeed, given recent events, a positive answer to the question, i.e. that Europe is a tiger, may not seem such a proud boast, for tigers are not exactly in fashion. But if you do think of Europe as a rather tired, listless economy, then what I aim to do tonight is to make you think again. My thesis is that this view of Europe is way out of date, that the European Union is rapidly developing into a dynamic economic superpower in the new global economy. Let's begin in the first half of the 1980s, which is not long ago, only 15 years ago, a mere drop in the ocean of history. But even as recently as that, Europe was a very different place. Cold War political and economic structures were still in place. Do you remember there was something called Comecon, which has vanished in history? Mikhail Gorbachev had not yet even come to power. The European Community, as it was then called, consisted of only 9 countries. Spain, Portugal, and Greece didn't join until the late 1980s. In those days, the European Community was smothering in internal difficulties. We were scrapping over the budget and the common agricultural policy. It was hard to make decisions because votes in our Council of Ministers normally required unanimity on the part of all the member states. people talked about Eurosclerosis, and they had a point. The glorious post-war years of European growth had petered out. But in the short period since then, extraordinary things have happened. In 1986, we set out to build the European single market, providing for free movement of labour, goods, services and capital between our member states. This gave the European community a profoundly significant new economic agenda of internal liberalisation. And this was accompanied by an equally radical new departure in decision-making, with a much more widespread use of a weighted majority voting system which broke the blockage of the unanimity requirement. 3 years later, the Cold War was suddenly over. The end of the Soviet Union brought new challenges and opportunities for the European community. At last, we were free to set our own agenda and face the responsibility of doing just that in a continent no longer artificially divided. The United States, of course, has been an ally and partner in this effort. 3 years later again, in 1992, we completed the single market program, although the work of breaking down internal barriers continues. At the same time, we negotiated the Maastricht Treaty, changing the European community into a European Union and setting out a program for foreign common and security policy and for more intensive cooperation in internal and justice policy. But most important of all, committing ourselves to achieving economic and monetary union by the end of the decade. Shortly after that, in 1995, the Union of 12 took in 3 new members, Austria, Finland and Sweden, and became 15. Now, I've listed those events because I think it's easy to overlook just how fast the European Union has been developing. We're often criticized for our shortcomings, and sometimes rightly so. But taken overall, it is a huge success story, and we are still very firmly on the move. Economically, the single market, although not yet fully complete, has removed internal barriers to trade within the Union and has allowed European business to take advantage of economies of scale. It has encouraged foreign investment and has led to greater competition, lower prices and better products. It is estimated that by 1994, EU GDP was 1.5% higher than it would have been without the single market program, and that by 1996 there were about 1 million extra jobs in the European Union. Today, with 370 million inhabitants, we are the world's largest integrated market, and with further enlargement, this market will get bigger. Moreover, we've pioneered a remarkable new approach to integration and liberalization between national economies and techniques of regulatory convergence, which I'm convinced will have much wider application in the future. From this base, the European Union now stands on the brink of a period of growth. Our GDP is expected to increase by 2.5% a year over the next 5 years. Not dramatic, but steady and sustainable. And the successful introduction of monetary union will add dynamism to this process. Now, it's often alleged that the European Union, despite this strength, has not been an effective force in international affairs. And I admit that our efforts to develop common foreign and security policy in the classical diplomatic sense have been painfully slow. But through our economic power, the European Union is increasingly present and active on the international stage. The community and the member states are now the largest international donor of development aid, giving over 50% of the total from all OECD countries. We contribute nearly 40% of all development aid to sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region in the world. We contribute over 1 billion ECU a year to the Central and Eastern European states. In the Middle East, the European Union is also by far the largest donor in support of the peace process. Our achievement is even more substantial in international trade policy. Building on the leadership we developed with the United States in the GATT Uruguay round, the EU, already itself the most open trading bloc in the world, has become the strongest champion of international trade liberalization in information technology, telecommunications, and more recently financial services. And on financial services, when the United States hesitated, the European Union gave leadership on our own. We now face two historic challenges. The first is economic and monetary union. The second is the enlargement of the European Union to include the countries of Central Europe and Cyprus. In a matter of weeks, we will decide which countries meet the conditions to join monetary union, which will begin next January. Because of the quite remarkable efforts that member states have made to reform their public finance to meet the convergence criteria set out in the Maastricht Treaty, it now seems certain that 11 member states will join the Union. Monetary union will strengthen the single market and is a logical extension of it. It will reduce transaction costs for European business and consumers. It will eliminate exchange rate risk for companies, leading to cross-border business activity which could otherwise simply be too hazardous or costly to contemplate. It will integrate European financial markets, improving capital flows and liquidity. It should enhance competition and lead to higher growth and employment. The introduction of the euro will also be the most significant event in the international monetary system since the end of Bretton Woods. It will have a major impact on global economic and financial relations. Although the EU represents 6% of the world's population, it accounts for almost 20% of the total GDP of OECD countries and 1/3 of world trade. The euro, therefore, is bound to be an international currency to match this economic weight. Eventually, I expect it to take its place beside the dollar as a major reserve currency. And there's every reason to believe that the euro will succeed, and certainly no reason to suggest, as a recent far-fetched article in Foreign Affairs did, that it will lead to divisions or conflicts among European Union members. But I am not Dr. Pangloss. This is not the best of all possible European unions. We know we have problems, notably our high level of unemployment. Some member states, like Britain, the Netherlands and Denmark, have introduced bold labour market reforms which have borne fruit. Elsewhere, structural rigidities persist. But I am convinced that EMU will accelerate their removal. We do have our own European view of how our societies should be organized, and we're not going to abandon it. But as we move forward in monetary union, we must accept that an integrated monetary system requires greater structural flexibility. The euro will help us achieve this. Member states have already made Herculean efforts to set their financial house in order. In a future in which the option of exchange rate adjustment no longer exists, they will have every incentive to make necessary structural economic reforms in order to increase competitiveness. And that will mean some tough political decisions, but it will also create jobs. At the same time, by pressing ahead with enlargement into Central Europe, the European Union will show that it is able to respond to a major political challenge, and in doing so, it itself will take on a new strategic and political importance. The internal market will become bigger, but the Union will also be enriched by its broader political identity and a changing character. And enlargement also has a strong moral component. It is based on principles of fraternity and community, the need to heal the wounds left by communism in Europe. Negotiations with Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Estonia, and Cyprus begin at the end of this month. For the other countries in the region, there will be regular progress reviews as their reforms proceed. It is important that these countries have the opportunity to catch up and join the EU when they've done so. There will be difficult decisions to face, such as over the common agricultural policy and institutional matters, but these are decisions that we would have to face anyway. Enlargement presents not only a challenge but an opportunity, the opportunity to create a new, dynamic, unified Europe. So what of the future? If Europe is a tiger, a powerful creature, the big question we now face is how are we to use that strength? And let me address three major priorities. First, we must continue to use our power to strengthen and further develop the multilateral economic system, a system based on law and respect for rules voluntarily accepted. Europeans are convinced multilateralists. We have built our own multilateral system in Europe, and it works. We believe that wider multilateralism is the best model for international cooperation and the best way to protect and promote European interests. That is my unshakable belief. It is why the European Union is championing the cause of a new global round of trade negotiations, a millennium round. We already have the inbuilt agenda left over from the Uruguay round. There are many areas in which we stand to make new gains. I'm also convinced that the multilateral system is best for the United States. We all benefit from the orderly and predictable international environment this creates, together with the independent system of dispute settlement, substituting the rule of law for the rule of the jungle. This system brings greater economic and political stability, which is good for growth and job creation. It will help us to work together also to tackle the burning issues of the coming years, such as environmental degradation. That is why I am alarmed by signs of a persistent tendency in some quarters in the United States to prefer to act unilaterally and to seek to impose US policy choices on others. We've seen from the Helms-Burton and D'Amato laws what damaging consequences this can have for relations between the US and its closest allies. It would be an historic mistake for the United States to go down that road. A second great challenge is to strengthen our relations with Asia, and in particular China. The World Bank once estimated that by the year 2000, half of world economic growth would come from Eastern and Southeast Asia. This now looks less probable, but the structural potential of Asia remains formidable, and the EU and the United States have a common interest in the return to higher growth there. We've recently taken steps to reinforce our political, economic, and cultural contacts with Asia through the Asia-Europe meeting known as Assam, the first Assam Summit, attended by the heads of government of all EU countries, all the ASEAN countries, and China, Japan, and Korea, was held in Bangkok in 1996. The second will take place in 2 weeks' time in London. This informal, flexible forum has already proved its worth in developing contact between the two regions. Now it faces a more serious test in responding to the economic and financial crisis in Asia. Europe has already been very active in global efforts to tackle the crisis, both through bilateral contributions, such as the $6 billion member states pledge for the second line of defense for Korea, and through the international financial institutions. Let us not forget that our member states contribute more than 30% of the IMF's funds, more than half as much again as the United States. But we're not complacent. More needs to be done. And I hope that at the Assam Summit in 2 weeks' time, we'll be able to agree on further concrete action with the following main elements. First, a trade and investment pledge, committing Assam leaders not only to resist any protectionist pressures that might arise as a result of the crisis, but also to undertake further multilateral liberalization of trade and investment. Second, a European package of technical assistance in the area of financial sector supervision. Europe has much experience and expertise to offer. We hope to appoint a high-level European representative to discuss the needs of the Asian countries and to establish a network of European experts to provide help. Third, a European contribution to a proposed trust fund at the World Bank to finance technical assistance activity. And fourthly, a review of our own cooperation programs with the region to deal with the social problems arising from the crisis. No country in Asia, or perhaps elsewhere, is, however, more important for the future of the global economy than China. China is forecast to be the second largest trading nation in 20 years' time. Achieving the successful integration of China into the international system is a huge strategic challenge for Europe and the United States. Next week, I'll be unveiling a new policy paper setting out the Commission's strategy for the development of EU-China relations in the coming years. Among the major recommendations, I'll be calling for annual summits between China and the EU, renewed efforts to complete the long-standing negotiations for China's accession to the WTO, a robust and frank dialogue on human rights in which Europe will put its money where its mouth is and implement concrete projects stimulating the growth of a civil society in China, improving the delivery of the significant number of development and assistance projects already financed by us in China, and generally stepping up cultural, political, and industrial relations. And so, third and finally, to the relationship between the European Union and the United States. I'm delighted and proud that the European Commission last week unanimously approved a major new initiative for EU-US trade relations, my proposal for a new transatlantic marketplace agreement. And I think that this shows that the European tiger is really beginning to roar, but to roar in a way which is helpful to us and to our partners. My proposal is that the European Union and the United States should agree to start very soon a major negotiation to remove non-tariff barriers to trade across the Atlantic, to commit ourselves to eliminate industrial tariffs through multilateral negotiations by the year 2010, provided a critical mass of other trading partners agree to do the same, to establish between Europe and the United States a free trade area in services, and to pursue further bilateral liberalization in areas such as government procurement, investment, and intellectual property. This is a major initiative, and deliberately so. It is designed to tackle the most serious impediments to transatlantic trade, by far the biggest economic relationship in the world, and to bring major economic benefits to business and consumers in Europe and the United States. Benefits which we have calculated would be as great as those from the Uruguay round itself. But the proposal goes beyond that. It is also intended to give a new political momentum to relations between Europe and the United States, and to be a further step in the refitting of that relationship for the post-Civil War period, building on the new transatlantic agenda which we embarked on in 1995. It is intended to give us new mechanisms and new incentives to avoid disputes or to solve the disputes which arise. There's broad political support for this proposal in Europe, and I'm delighted by the positive response that I've already received in Washington. The proposal has been carefully designed to be entirely compatible with all our multilateral commitments. But beyond that, it is designed actually to promote the ambitions that I've described for further multilateral liberalization in future negotiations. The proposal for tariff liberalization is explicitly multilateral in the sense that it has to be implemented on a multilateral basis. The proposal for bilateral free trade in services is intended to set an example for others to follow and to create a strong inducement for them to do so. Indeed, I believe that by working together in such a bilateral negotiation, Europe and the United States will be able to lay much of the groundwork for a further multilateral negotiation and so to give a kick-start to the whole process. I hope the United States will join us in this vision. We both have much to gain through even closer economic cooperation, removing the sort of regulatory barriers which are now increasingly important. The protectionist alternative is a total fallacy. If Europe and the United States seek to protect themselves from each other, we will both be political and economic losers, and so will the rest of the world. I believe that we should work together to give joint leadership in responding to the challenges of economic change. That joint leadership will bring us benefits which will extend to others. Europe has equipped itself to give that leadership. The United States has long had the power to do so. We now both need to show that we also have the will. The European Union, ladies and gentlemen, is in good shape and is set to go from strength to strength. There is much to do, but we are now better equipped to meet our challenges than we have ever been before. Let the United States and its European partner now seize the opportunity to work more actively than ever in pursuit of the goals that I believe we share. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Leon. We now have an opportunity for questions. There are 2 microphones here on the floor, 2 in the balcony. I'd like to remind people that when we say questions, we want questions. They come 1 per customer and are relatively brief. Let me start with this microphone. And please identify yourself before you speak.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jean Vanout. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. In the context of the transatlantic relationship, do you see fair trade rules as now defined being replaced by one common competition policy, and what form would that common competition policy take?
As far as competition policy is concerned, we have had an agreement with the United States for cooperation, although not for common rules. We believe that the time has come, not in the context just of the EU-US relationship, but in the wider world, as part of the new Millennium Round, to begin international discussion on a set of common rules which would be accepted by the world community for competition policy. I think that there is a high degree of commonality in the fundamental approach of Europe and the United States, and I think that essentially the international rules that we would negotiate would be drawn from that. They would not be as comprehensive as the full panoply of competition policy in either Europe or the United States, but I think that there are certain fundamental points that could be agreed internationally and that we would benefit from by involving other countries in similar commitments with an appropriate dispute settlement mechanism to make sure that they observe them. We are not talking about a new international competition authority. We are talking about agreed rules to be applied by all competition policies that are party to such an agreement.
Thank you.
My name is Josh Freeman, and I'm a joint student at the Kennedy School and the Business School. Recently, Commerce Secretary Daley spoke here in the forum, and at that time I asked him a question about his views on the prospects of Chinese accession to the WTO, and he was very pessimistic on if or when China would be able to join the WTO. I wonder if you could give your assessment of the prospects for Chinese accession and your views on what the impact on the WTO as an organization would be if China were to accede.
Well, we very much want China to become a member of the WTO, and we think that the WTO would benefit from it. it is not a truly world trade organization if it excludes a country of 1,200 million people. But of course, for membership to be possible, this is not just a club where you include people because you like them or because you think that it would be a bigger club if they were there. There has to be acceptance of rules. And what we have been doing in our negotiations with the Chinese is to try and evolve a concept in which they agree to accept the rules, agree to make commitments that are commensurate with their size and importance and stage of development in the world economy, but we, for our part, show our understanding of the fact that they are still developing by agreeing that not everything that they should do should be done at the beginning and that there should be phased implementation of the rules. Now, in the negotiations that have taken place, we reached agreement with the Chinese last autumn on the basic principles of tariffs that they should apply. They have yet to give details of how that would happen, and of course everything depends upon the details reflecting the principles. Last month, I proposed certain principles with regard to services. Those were accepted as being the direction in which China should go, but not the detail. Again, we are waiting for a commitment from them on services. So I don't know how long it'll take. The ball is very much in their court. The only thing I will say is that from my conversations with the top Chinese leaders, I have no doubt at all that they are committed to opening up their economy and to making the changes that are necessary for them to join the WTO. But I think that they are nervous about making commitments of a particular kind with a particular time scale when the process of liberalization of the Chinese economy that they do want is one which is so hazardous for them and so full of perils. You only have to look at the consequences of dealing with the many bankrupt state-owned enterprises and the social risks of unemployment and so on that flow from that. And I think that the pace at which they will be prepared to accept WTO commitments will be dictated not so much by the demands of the WTO process, but by their own assessment of what the traffic will bear in terms of the speed of internal reform. And that's very much a reflection of the conversations I've had now on several occasions with Zhu Rongji, who's just become the Prime Minister of China. So it's impossible to say how quickly that will all happen. The process is well advanced. What's needed is fairly clear. We have made our position clear. We are ready to move as soon as the Chinese are ready to move. But how quickly they will go will really depend upon how quickly they feel that they can advance with their reforms for reasons other than the WTO, and that I wouldn't care to predict.
Right side of Val.
M.J. Peterson. I teach out at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. You've been very eloquent on the U.S.-EU partnership, on the need to integrate China, on the problems of Southeast Asia and Central Europe. My question is, where does Japan fit into all of this? Japan, after all, is a fairly significant economic unit.
Well, I wasn't trying to go on a tour of the whole world, so I must apologize for excluding Japan, but it is not because Japan is outside our consideration. Japan, of course, is a country with which we have a close relationship. We have followed a policy somewhat different from that of the United States, slightly less of wielding the big stick and slightly more of seeking to engage with Japan. And we think that the results have been at least as good, to be quite frank. But when we say the results have been at least as good, that doesn't mean that we have, either of us, even though pursuing a slightly different approach, achieved what is necessary. And I think that what is necessary as far as Japan is concerned is a substantial further deregulation program. They are committed to a new deregulation program We, because of the experience that I've referred to in setting up the single market and our enormous experience in deregulation, have actually put forward some 200 suggestions for them to take up. And our view of what we think of their new program will obviously be reflected by the proportion of our suggestions that are actually incorporated. Past deregulation programs have accepted quite a bit of the ideas that we put forward, and we have made progress, and European exports to Japan have actually increased very substantially. I would also add that if you think this is a soft approach, it's not what the Japanese think, because we have shown a readiness to go to the WTO and take up dispute settlement, the dispute settlement mechanism, rather more rapidly than the Japanese would have wished. And a good example of this is what in our view was the discriminatory regime with regard to spirits, whiskey and cognac. And we won the case, and to be fair to the Japanese, they have changed their tax system. It has been a major change, with major vested interests in Japan resisting it, but they have done so. So I think it is possible to make progress for the opening up of the Japanese economy. But I think we now have a separate problem in Japan, apart from the regulatory one. And that is, of course, that the Japanese economy has been sluggish now for a substantial period of time. And also the fact that Japan has a very important part to play in the Asian world more generally. And we think that it could play a significant part if it followed the right macroeconomic policies. And therefore we share with the United States the view that what has been done to stimulate the Japanese economy up to now has been substantially inadequate. And we have, in our own way, called for the Japanese to stimulate domestic demand, not by the kind of infrastructure projects that they've often gone for in the past, but by lowering taxes and stimulating demand in that way. So we are very closely engaged with Japan. We welcome the fact that on the political side, Japan is taking a larger part in the world stage. We are participating in CADO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, designed to reduce the risk of nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula. We welcome the fact that Japan is playing its part in helping in Bosnia, and so on. So we have a fairly comprehensive approach towards Japan, the outlines of which I've just given.
Good evening. I'm Amita Paul. I'm a civil servant from India and a Mason Fellow at the Kennedy School. My question is prompted by a BBC News item this morning unveiling perhaps yet another agenda for the much-reformed UNCTAD. I would like to know the European Union's stand on UNCTAD. And a related question, at the risk of taking you around the world again, is what does the EU see as its responsibility towards least developed island economies and least developed countries, island economies, and economies in transition?
Well, as far as UNCTAD is concerned, I think you're right to say that it's been much reformed, and I think under Mr. Recupero it is in very much better shape than it was, and very much better targeted. Frankly, I think that the fact that he has come from a trade background and does not simply regard UNCTAD as a sort of pressure group to demand more development aid, but is focusing much more on setting up the kind of policies that will lead to structural change in some of those countries to stimulate growth and development rather than to be reliant on a dependency culture. All of that is to the good, and I welcome it, and I think that UNCTAD has a continuing role to play, but not a unique role. And talking about India, I think it would be very, very helpful if India, in the World Trade Organization, were to accept that it stood to gain from the negotiation of an agreement setting out the terms on which investment would take place, because it would encourage investment if investors had greater certainty and knowledge of the regime that would apply when they came to a country such as India. And I think that the fear that some people in some parts of the world have, that there would be something imposed upon them, is a misguided fear. because the World Trade Organization is something that is new. The developing countries really do have a determining say and can't just be pushed around there, and that's a good thing. And we saw in the first Singapore ministerial meeting in December 1996 that that was the case. They have nothing to fear and everything to gain by engaging in negotiation to create an agreement which would stimulate investment, because it would give investors a greater certainty as to the terms in which they were investing in a country such as India. As far as the least developed country is concerned, the European Union took an initiative in that Singapore ministerial conference in December 1996, when, frankly, the issue was regarded as having been closed because in the preparatory months of discussion, nothing had been agreed. We insisted on reopening it and getting enshrined into the communiqué firm language about greater involvement in the world trading system and greater assistance to the least developed countries. And when we came back from Singapore, some of us insisted that we must put our policy where our mouth is, and to put forward proposals, for example, to extend the benefits of the convention governing our relations with African, Caribbean and Pacific countries to other least developed countries which were outside that arrangement. So we were playing a very active role there too.
My name is Eric Rausch. I'm a graduate student at MIT. How do you respond to the criticism that the enlargement of the Union towards the East would ultimately result in a shallower Union, and it would make the prospects for deeper integration more difficult?
For what more difficult?
The prospects for deeper integration in the Union.
Well, I think that that's a legitimate anxiety, but it is one that can be met. And the interesting thing has been that in every previous enlargement of the European Union, and don't forget we've expanded from a small number of 6 with successive enlargements, that fear has been expressed. And every time what has actually happened has been that there has been agreement for institutional change leading to greater integration rather than the reverse, because people have been alerted to that risk. And I think that in order to achieve the enlargement in a way that does not lead to the slowing down of our capacity to take decisions, institutional changes will be needed. Some were made in the Amsterdam Treaty negotiations, but not enough, because, frankly, at that stage, the actual prospect of enlargement still seemed some way away. And the European Union, not unique in this wicked vale of tears in this respect, tends only to tackle the most difficult problems when it is urgently necessary to do so. I believe before we do have a further enlargement, it will be necessary to consider such questions as the composition of the Commission, the balance of votes in the Council of Ministers, and other questions that may sound aridly institutional but are absolutely the key to the point that you make. If we do tackle those, I think we can combine an enlargement of the European Union with ensuring that institutionally we have the capacity to take decisions and are not slowed down by the fact that we have more members.
Dirk Marcus, I'm a visiting PhD fellow at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. You said that certain countries are quite successful in dealing with internal rigidities, like Britain, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Other countries, among which could see France, Germany, and Italy, haven't really addressed those issues yet. Do you think that the problems these countries are facing, such as high and rising unemployment, as well as internal rigidities, could limit the further integration of the Union?
I don't think that will happen because, as I was saying in the speech, I believe that what has happened has been a very interesting process in the move towards economic and monetary union. What has happened has been that countries which have had a culture of inflation, a culture of unsound public finance with high deficits, have taken the extremely difficult policy decisions in order to bring their public finances in order, and have been successful in doing so, and also are beginning to see the benefits of doing that. Now, I was in Spain 3 weeks ago. there is a completely different culture in that country. They have absolutely brought down the budget deficit massively. They have brought down inflation rates, and it's even beginning to have an effect on unemployment. So countries can and do change. And if I can draw the comparison with my own country, without EMU, in the 1970s, we were a byword for inefficiency, bloated state enterprises, trade union leaders dominating the country, and all the structural ills that you'll be very familiar with. We changed that. And now, with a change of party in government, we can see that there is now a national consensus to preserve those changes. Now, that's what's happened coming to EMU. I believe that if coming to EMU has brought about a change leading to financial respectability and sound finances, the implementation of EMU will force structural changes of the kind that are necessary and that have begun in some countries, and will force that to happen on a much more substantial scale. Why will it force that to happen? Put bluntly, because there will be no alternative. It will not be possible to have high budget deficits, because that will not be allowed and that will be effectively policed. And the weapon, or drug as I would call it, of devaluations, inflation, and low interest rates, which provide a short-term boost but a long-term disaster, will simply by definition not be available, and therefore they will have to face up to the structural problems by joining EMU and participating in EMU, just as they have already faced up to the problems of public finances by getting themselves in a position to start in EMU.
My name is Nancy Mindick, and I have a two-part question. One is, could you elaborate on the influence that you think the European currency is going to have on the world's economy? And secondly, you mentioned that the new European currency would take its place beside the dollar. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, it's impossible to be precise because we've never done anything like this before and we really don't know. But I think, first of all, I believe that the creation of the euro will be beneficial for the rest of the world. Why? Because it will strengthen the European economy in the way that I have described. If it does strengthen the European economy, that is beneficial for the rest of the world so long as it continues to be an open economy. And I believe that our record has shown that in recent years we have become an extremely open economy. We have been one of the leaders in arguing for the liberalization of world trade and the world economy, and will continue to be so. Therefore, a European economy which is stronger but continues to be a leader for liberalization and open to the rest of the world is beneficial to the rest of the world as well. Secondly, more specifically, I think that it is likely that more of the world's trade will take place in euros, will be denominated in euros, and that over a period of time, a larger part of the world's reserves will be held in euros. We will become a reserve currency. Let me hasten to add, and those who studied the experience of sterling will confirm this, this is by no means an unmixed blessing. There are disadvantages and responsibilities as a result of being a reserve currency as well as benefits. But I think that that is what will happen. And I think as far as the United States is concerned, the creation of a monetary bipolar system will be something that will be healthy rather than damaging, because the United States, too, has suffered some of the problems and disadvantages of being a major reserve currency as well as the benefits of it.
We can do two more questions, one at each microphone.
Good evening. My name is Barbara Mack, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm currently writing a paper about the audiovisual policy in the EU, especially since the 1989 directive. And I was wondering if you could comment on the developments in this area with regard to the transatlantic business dialogue.
Well, I think I can answer that very briefly because there haven't been many developments in this area as a result of the transatlantic business dialogue. I don't think that the European Union has itself advanced very substantially further in the very recent years in this area. It has maintained its policy of allowing support to be given for its own cultural identity. It has not been prepared to allow that to be negotiated away in the Uruguay round, nor will it allow it to be done in the course of the negotiations in the OECD on the MAI, nor will it allow it to be done in the negotiations on the new transatlantic marketplace. And I do think that there is need for an effort of understanding in the United States on this. This is not just a form of European protectionism. I speak very strongly and feelingly on this because coming from Britain, we don't have the problem, or perhaps in some ways we have it worse because we're even more open to the push of the American audiovisual industry because we share the language, but at least we share it. For continental Europe, with its diverse cultures, with its diverse languages, with its much smaller markets, the concept of being totally flooded by American Hollywood productions is something which I believe people are entitled to regard as a legitimate cause for concern. How you handle that is a different matter. Whether you handle it by giving assistance to European producers of cultural material, or whether you handle it in a more direct way is a matter of controversy, and I personally would always go for the former rather than the latter. But I do think that strong an exponent of free trade though I am, to regard films and things of that kind as being exactly in the same category as ball bearings is to have a unidimensional view of the world. So that's why things are as they are.
Certainly, I'm Peter Hall. I teach European politics here. If the transatlantic marketplace that you propose succeeds, it will reduce levels of protection across the Atlantic. I think we all know that another way for a nation to protect its products is to devalue, to depreciate its currency, therefore lowering the price of its exports and raising the price of imports. So I wonder whether you feel that movement on a transatlantic marketplace must be coupled to some sort of agreement about relative parities between the new euro, the American dollar, and maybe other currencies. And I think we know that that's very difficult to secure, not least because I'm not sure the Europeans agree on whether they want a strong euro or not. So I wonder whether you think the two need to be coupled or not, and what the prospects for some sort of a broader currency agreement, perhaps made more pressing by these trade achievements, might be.
I don't myself think that it will be the new transatlantic marketplace that will necessitate further thought about the relationship of currencies. I think it will be the creation of the euro that will lead to that. And we have suggested already in the context, before we got to the new transatlantic marketplace, of the new transatlantic agenda initiative, that there should be discussions between Europe on monetary issues. Now, whether or not there should be any kind of formal agreement about parities is a very vexed question. Apart from anything else, one of the serious questions that has to be asked is, could such an agreement stick? And after all, we are not wholly without experience of this. There were, in the mid-1980s, the Louvre and Plaza agreements, which were in this ballpark at least. I'm not suggesting they were identical in character to what you might have in mind. And they had a short-term effect, but they came adrift. So there are many people, irrespective of one's views on how strong the euro should or should not be, who would have grave doubts about the capacity of Europe and the United States to reach an agreement of this kind. And I am one who shares that view. On the other hand, I think that without attempting to set up a rigid arrangement of that kind, it certainly will and ought to be the case that there should be much greater discussion of monetary issues between Europe and the United States, and that, frankly, will be easier to take place in a more structured and orderly way when the bulk of Europe, at least, will have the single currency, the euro, behind it to bring to bear in those discussions. What the outcome of those discussions will be in today's changed circumstances, how far there can be convergence of policy, either because of convergence of agreement on what the policy should be, or because it's technically possible to have an effective convergence that really meaningfully leads to results, I'm agnostic on. What I would say is, let us not attempt anything too ambitious, to start with at least, and probably, in my view, beyond the short term as well. But let us at least start the process of much greater discussion and consultation on this issue, and let us just see where that leads.
Let me ask you to join me in thanking Sir Leon for an extremely lucid presentation and wishing him well for his great new venture.